At this time, I'd like to introduce Phyllis Saranen, who will introduce our speaker and presentation for today.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. I think we have a very good audience this afternoon, and we are going to have a very interesting speaker. Dr. Douglas Merrey spent most of his 40-year career in other countries, places like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and several other places, traveling with his family literally during much of their lives. He has worked in the area of resource management with his PhD in anthropology, working primarily in water and irrigation, farm irrigation. In the last 2 years, he has been particularly working with smallholders in developing countries, that is, small farmers in developing countries, to adapt to climate change, which is a critical issue, if I may editorialize here, because one of the dangers of climate change is mass starvation and mass migration in response to starvation. The more we can help the small farmers in underdeveloped countries, the better off the world will be. Thank you very much, Dr. Merrey, for agreeing to give this talk, and I look forward to your information.
Thank you, Phyllis. In a way, I think you've already given my conclusion, so we can stop here in a way. Speaking at 1:30 is always a bad time because it's easy enough for you guys to go to sleep and have a little nap. And doing it by Zoom, I can't even tell who's napping, but I'll try to keep you awake. So what I'm going to talk about is work that mostly I've been indirectly associated with, not directly, being done by some of my colleagues that I've worked with in the past and continue to work with. So starting with my outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and how it's challenging food and water systems. I'm going to talk about water and food security in general for small farmers in developing countries. And I want to link all of this to achieving the sustainable development goals that the world has promised to end hunger and poverty and so on by 2030. But I'm not sure we're going to make it. Then a little bit on the role of international research, because I'm reporting on some of the solutions they've developed. And then I'm going to go in a little bit of detail for 3 examples of solutions that are scalable and being scaled. But then the challenge of going to scale. I'll discuss a bit of that and then come to some conclusions and next steps. So we all know that climate change is leading to more frequent and more severe droughts and floods. It's causing temperatures to rise. It's making crop tests even worse than they have normally been over the thousands of years. It's made rainfall unpredictable. So if you're a rain-fed farmer and the rains don't come at a key point in the growing cycle of your crop, you're going to get a very small or no harvest. And of course, it lies behind the increase in storms and so on. So just a few visuals. Floods can be a lot smaller than these too. These are the more spectacular ones, and they happen all over around the world. Our country, Europe, China, Africa, Latin America, Asia. Droughts. These are actually cattle trying to find something to eat. And you can see the cracks show you how dry it's become. And just as a reminder, remember last year, particularly in the summer, this country was facing severe drought in what, maybe almost half of the continental US. And then I always like to put this one in. You know, a lot of people, usually women and girls, but sometimes boys as well, carry buckets of water every day for long distances just to have some water for domestic use. And it's very hard to grow crops if you have to carry it from afar. And pests. You may all remember that there were huge swarms of locusts in East Africa, which got into the Middle East and parts of South Asia as well. So this is a rather dramatic photograph from Kenya. We've seen versions of this graph in other presentations, and what it shows you is the fairly dramatic rise in temperatures since about 1850 and really starting more like around 1925 to 30. And it's become rather rapid since then. And aside from the impacts it has on weather cycles and so on, heat itself is debilitating to humans, obviously. At a certain point, you can't work anymore, but also crops. It gets too hot already in some parts of the world to grow maize and wheat and rice and get good production. So productivity of major staple crops is already affected by rising temperatures. I want to make sure we understand the difference between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is really the trying to reverse climate change. And so we hear about this all the time of reducing our carbon footprint, moving to more renewable kinds of energy sources, not getting rid of fossil fuels, and so on. That's really essential for the long-term survival of us, of humanity. And it's largely the responsibility of the rich industrial countries, and even not so rich like China, because we're the ones causing all of this climate change. It's not some smallholder in Africa or Asia that's causing it, but they're the ones most severely affected. So they need to adapt to maintain food and water security and their livelihoods, nutrition, and so on. All countries need to adapt. We obviously will have to adapt too. But today we're going to focus on smallholder farmers in developing countries and how to help them adapt. The UN always has long-winded kinds of definitions of food security, and I'm going to do water security, and I'm not going to read it. It just basically means that food security exists when everyone has enough safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and their food preferences. Water security has an even more long-winded one from the United Nations, but again, it's basically having enough water to live at a reasonable level without disasters, without diseases, being able to grow food, to have water for drinking, and so on. Roughly 1 billion people a year do not have food security as was just defined. Water security may be more like 2 billion people do not have it year-round. And here's a graphic for India, but you can do it for a lot of other areas too, that shows you that a big percentage of India faces extremely high water stress. There's simply not enough water to meet all of the needs that they have for living and for maintaining their livelihoods. All of this links to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. I think all of you are familiar with that. There were 17 SDGs that were agreed to about some years ago anyway, 2018 or so. By 2030, the world is committed to ending poverty, ending hunger, achieving food security, ensuring healthy lives, having clean water and sanitation for everybody, and so on. There are 17 of them. Those are probably the ones most important for my presentation. And it's important to understand that there are connections among all of these. That is to say, you need adequate water to grow crops for food. You need food and water for energy. Ecosystems need to be sustained so that they can continue to provide the services that they do. And these are highly linked, and what you do in one thing can affect other parts of the system. I want to get to smallholder farmers now in Asia and Africa. It's a very highly variable group, of many hundreds of millions of people. I'm going to generalize a bit. Generally, farms are only 2, 3, 4, 5 acres, and often they're even less than that. That doesn't mean there aren't larger farmers, but the vast majority have these relatively small holdings. Mostly they depend on rainfall. They don't have access to irrigation. Most of the food produced in developing countries is produced on these small farms. And they employ more than half of the population in many developing countries, where there are also very few alternatives to making a living. They have very minimal access to capital, so it's hard to invest in better seeds or fertilizer or irrigation and so on. Their markets don't work all that well, particularly in Africa. So their prices that they get for their produce are relatively low, but the inputs and the technologies are very expensive. Fertilizer is 7 to 10 times as expensive in many African countries as it is in the United States. So how can they even buy a bag of fertilizer if it's going to cost so much money? All of this makes them very vulnerable to shocks, and climate change is exacerbating this vulnerability. Before proceeding to some of the solutions, I want to talk a little bit about international agricultural research. Over the years, partnerships have developed among hundreds, maybe even thousands, of all kinds of research institutions and universities at national level, regional level, international level, universities in the rich countries, the US and Europe and Japan, as well as universities and so on in developing countries. One thing that's helped establish and keep those partnerships going is something called the CGIAR. It used to stand for something, but now that's the name. It's a consortium of about 15 international research institutions, each one specialized in some different area. Water management was the one I worked for. Others work on particular kinds of crops, on fish, on policy, and so on. The consortium is funded at roughly $1 billion a year, but this is very unstable. And some years donors don't cough up what they've promised, which makes it somewhat hard to plan and implement a long-term research program, but they do their best. They've invested a lot in creating strong partnerships among themselves and with institutions in developing countries, and acting both as doing a lot of really good, high quality research, but also as brokers between institutions that have highly specialized capacity and tools and so on, and developing countries, and also between the researchers and the policymakers. They have mandates for both research and capacity development. And when the donors look at what they're getting for their money, they do want good science, but they want that science to be leading to real impacts. And if you can't show that you're leading to impacts, that you're having some real significant impacts on poor people ultimately, and policies and so on, the money won't continue. So the focus of the CG now has become almost single-minded: how to enable smallholders to become more resilient to climate change and adapt to the changes and thrive during those changes, not just survive, but thrive. I want to talk about 3 examples of climate-smart solutions aimed at transforming agriculture. But I want to emphasize this is only a very small sample, things that I've been associated with either directly or indirectly. There are lots of other kinds of innovations coming along: new crop varieties, new management practices, shifting from monocrops to trying to have sustainable agricultural agroecosystems. And these things fit into that, but it's a wider context. So the 3 topics are: first, irrigation using solar pumps; then the development of real-time weather forecasting services using cheap satellite data; and then building on that, looking for ways to provide affordable index-based flood and drought insurance using that data to smallholders. So this graph shows you the degree to which the cost of solar power has changed. Solar panels used to be extremely expensive. They've become cheap enough that they are affordable even for maybe not the smallest farmers, but for farmers that, you know, that have a few acres and a bit in access to some capital. From the 1980s in South Asia, meaning India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, small diesel and gasoline and electric pumps started becoming available, and it led to what has been called a pump revolution. They're relatively low cost. They were often subsidized, or if you had an electric pump, they've built grids, electricity grids throughout large parts of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and you can connect to the grid to power your pump. And it was often free or extremely low cost. On the other hand, it was bankrupting the electricity companies. This has been a major contributor to those countries achieving food security. Certainly India and Bangladesh they produce enough food nationally to feed all of their people. Whether it's distributed equitably is a different issue. But the subsidies are expensive. They produce a lot of greenhouse gases. And in many parts, not only of India and Pakistan, but China, Mexico, and elsewhere, having access to pumps is draining the groundwater aquifers. People are pumping faster than the water is being recharged. You've all heard of the Ogallala aquifer out west here, for example. This is happening to that aquifer as well. In the past decades, solar pumps have become cheaper and more available. The costs have declined, and new firms have come into the market in both Asia and Africa. For example, there's a company in Kenya called Future Pump that's selling solar pumps that are maybe $300 to $400 each all over Africa. Once you have a solar pump installed, the operating costs are nothing. You know, there's no energy cost. The sun is free. There's no pollution, no greenhouse gases, and no problem with the power supply that people on the grid frequently have, particularly in India. So it's kind of a win-win from many perspectives. And as a result, there's a major effort underway to promote their uptake throughout Asia and Africa. I want to switch now to India specifically, where researchers have tested 3 business models. And the first 2 of them are now part of a $50 billion program to roll out in solar irrigation and basically shift all of agriculture to solar irrigation. The first model is using solar cooperatives, groups of farmers organized into a co-op that have their own little microgrid panels, and they sell excess power back to the grid at a profitable rate. Solar power as a remunerative crop, and I'll come back to that. The next model is simply individual model of farmers buying a solar pump, usually with subsidies, and pumping away. And the third model is still at a very early level of piloting, but solar irrigation as a service. So for example, maybe you rent the solar pump. Farmers come and rent it for a day and irrigate their crops. Or even there are a few firms in India and parts of Africa where they will bring the pump connected to your water source, irrigate your field, and you pay a fee. But we don't know very much about that yet. It's still at a very early stage, and there are only a few pilot efforts that I'm aware of. Coming to Spark. This was sparked, so to speak, by a pilot study in Gujarat in West India, where a group of, I don't think it was quite 10 farmers were helped to form a co-op and purchase the solar panels and negotiated a deal with the grid so that they could sell excess power back to the electricity grid at a very good rate. And they also sell power to some of their neighbors. You can run a wire to somebody's electric pump and then let them pump for a certain period and they pay for it. This has worked out really well. Unfortunately, I don't have data beyond that first year and a half period. But what this graph shows is that once it took off, their incomes from both agriculture, because pumping costs are less than they were, and from the sale of electricity to their neighbors and sale of electricity to the grid, led to huge increases in their incomes. And as a result, not only the Gujarat government, but all of the national government and many of the state governments are now rolling this model out in a big way. Among the states in India, it varies as to how attractive the rate is that the grid pays to the farmers. But it's being rolled out, and hopefully it's going to go well. So the institute that did all this, that started all this, commissioned an evaluation in 2020. And because they're still at an early stage, they had to use, economic modeling and so on, and there had to be lots of assumptions, but they tried to project to 2040. And they concluded that the potential returns on the $50 billion investment from the government and co-investment from farmers is going to be huge, many, many times over the initial investment. If people sell their excess power to the grid rather than pumping more water than they used to pump, it should result in water saving and thus protecting the groundwater aquifer. But I'll come back to that. Potentially, there will be large increases in farmers' incomes. As I said, not only sales to the grid, but sales elsewhere and increased profitability of agriculture from reduced pumping costs. And it will reduce the government subsidies for energy, which currently are, as I said, bankrupting the grid, some of the grid companies. And it'll lead to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So all of this is very promising, but I emphasize the jury is still out. We're still at an early stage. And I think there's a major question whether, in fact, farmers will still end up pumping the aquifers dry, but we shall see. Moving to Africa, in the past decade, a lot of researchers have realized there's a lot more groundwater, not very deep, that is available and could be used, but not in large scale. You couldn't do large scale commercial farming with it, but you can do a lot of small scale farming, as well as using the water for domestic purposes and so on. So the solar pumps are being rolled out there too, mainly based on groundwater. And there's a big effort. My research colleagues are working with private firms, for example, trying to set up value chains, make sure that people get information about the pumps, that there would be backup and technical support for installation and any repairs that are needed, and dealing with the problem of financing. Because $400 may not sound like, well, let's say it's a bit more, let's say $500 or $600, including, the other equipment you need to irrigate. That's a lot of money for a farmer with 2 acres of land, 3 acres of land. They don't have it frequently. Sometimes people can get it from their families. Sometimes you can borrow it at high rates, but making that financing available has been a big challenge. And they're piloting things like leasing or lease purchase, where you get your pump and you're paying a monthly fee and eventually you pay it off and then it's yours. The other challenge that they're facing is trying to target the pumps to women and relatively poor people, because women have relatively less access to information and to services and so on. And in a few places now, the sustainability issue is beginning to come. So a major challenge in the future will be managing pumping so they don't overpump aquifers. Now I want to move on to the next one, real-time weather forecasting. With climate change, rainfall is getting more erratic and unpredictable, and it makes agriculture very risky. If you invest a lot of money in new seeds and fertilizer and so on, and then it doesn't rain for 3 weeks, you lose your investment. But there have been really rapid improvements in the availability of satellite data and analysis of that data. And one particular, but not the only example, is something called the South Asia Drought Monitoring System, set up in Sri Lanka, but it covers all of South Asia. It uses fancy algorithms that I could never understand to analyze high-resolution satellite data on vegetation, soil moisture, and temperature. And they can measure the anticipated severity of drought in real time for several weeks ahead, and at very localized level, down to let's say a village or a small town. So this has potential as a very practical tool to advise extension services and ultimately farmers directly on how likely droughts or floods, for that matter, are and what they might need to do to maintain their production. So it's been tested in a number of places in Bihar, North India, which is drought prone mostly, but parts of it are flood prone. They have provided packages of insurance, drought proof seeds, and the weather forecasting. And I'll come back to the insurance. In South India, they did an experiment which showed a big increase in yields and incomes of those farmers that had access to the weather service, as opposed to those who did not. So these services are being rolled out fairly rapidly in Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and they had even gotten it going in Afghanistan with World Bank support, but that I'm not sure what's happened since the new government came in. And they're beginning to roll this out in Africa. This is just kind of an example from a district in South India. And you can see on the left side, the first week, there's hardly any red. But over the weeks, it gets redder and redder. And these are all areas that are subject to drought, that they're not getting enough rain for their crops, even though overall the average for the district is probably not horrible. But in the experiment, they were able to communicate all this to the extension staff. The extension staff were able to advise farmers on what varieties to plant and how to deal with soil moisture management. Building on this is one more step, index-based insurance. So what is that? Normally insurance, crop insurance in the United States, the farmer buys the insurance, he makes his claim if there's a drought or flood and his crop isn't very good. The adjuster comes and looks at the crop and says, okay, this is what we'll pay you. But to do that with many hundreds of thousands of 1 acre, 2 acre farms is simply too expensive, can't be done practically. But an index-based insurance is based on an index that's correlated with farmers' losses. So they measure rainfall, temperature, and so on, and they establish an index of the vegetation levels you would expect given the rainfall and temperature and so on. And when it falls below a certain threshold, farmers get paid. The more further below it falls, the more they get paid. And those farmers who are lucky enough to get enough rain, they don't get paid. And this can be sold basically through your cell phone. People sign up on their cell phone, they make their payment through cell phone. They receive the payments if they're going to get paid from the insurance by cell phone. So it's cheap and has a lot of potential. There's a lot of benefits. Farmers' productivity can increase because it's less risky to invest in higher production. It protects their assets. They don't have to sell their cattle to pay their debts. It prevents total disaster. So the number of farmers being covered is slowly increasing in a number in Africa and Asia. They have a figure for India here that's something like 1 out of 4 farmers have this insurance. I'm not sure it's that high, but it's probably growing fairly rapidly. The next step in all of this is bundling that crop insurance with better seeds and fertilizer and so on, and the advice on how to use it best. And this is a picture of farmers in Bihar, India, North India, and you'll notice that many of them are women. They aren't all men. And these 2 women are Sri Lankan women holding up their checks from the insurance company that paid them when their rice production fell below the index that was established. So this is being done with partnerships with insurance companies, with governments, with seed companies, and NGOs, local community-based organizations, to help target these services to women and to marginal farmers. Substantial payouts have already been made in Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka. In India, it too is being considered for another multi-billion-dollar national crop insurance program, because it provides a practical and cost-effective way to provide that insurance. One more example is index-based livestock insurance. Particularly in East Africa, livestock keepers, many of whom are pastoralists, they're not settled farmers, they wander around their areas with their herds, suffer catastrophic losses from drought. And these droughts are increasing in frequency and severity from climate change. So again, these index-based livestock insurance uses satellite data to measure the pasture quality and predict livestock mortality. This is being rolled out among pastoralists in Ethiopia and Kenya. And for example, Kenya last year had 90,000 cattle worth more than $30 million insured, and $10 million has been paid out to date over the last 4 or 5 years. And women constitute 45% of the insurance buyers. And all of this is done again through the cell phones. So all these examples are being scaled out. They're being combined with other innovations, but far too slowly, given the challenge of climate change and the number of people that are affected. Solar pumps lend themselves to private firms investing in producing the product and marketing and so on, but it needs some government policy support, for example, to make sure that they don't pay taxes that make it too expensive for farmers, and the infrastructure investments to make sure they have access to urban markets and so on. Setting up the value chains, dealing with targeting finance, these are all very challenging things. And both governments and private firms have roles to play here, and NGOs. And I mentioned that problem again. Will the farmers pump the aquifers dry? But that's another presentation. Weather prediction is a public good. It needs sustained funding, but not very large funding. It's not expensive relative to most kinds of things that you could think of doing to reach a large scale. And insurance products lend themselves to public-private partnerships, where the government, for example, provides the weather data and predictions and so on. It's still not sufficiently profitable for private sector companies to invest on a big scale and really scale it out to large percentage of farmers. It still needs some support before it takes off. So I remind you that poor countries didn't create the climate crisis, we did, but they suffer most of the damage, and they're least able to cover the costs of adaptation, let alone mitigation. They can't contribute much to mitigation. In about 2015, the rich countries promised at least $100 billion a year in financial support for adaptation in developing countries. This promise has not been kept, nowhere near. Some countries are indeed supporting agricultural research and implementation. The US actually has some very good and innovative programs and is supporting some of the solar pump work that I mentioned. But the level of funding from the US to international agricultural research has not increased in real terms since the early 2000s. The World Bank and regional development banks like the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank are investing in these things. Maybe not enough, but I was involved in writing the proposal for a project called Accelerating the Impact of CG Climate Research for Africa, where the World Bank is indeed financing rolling out some of the weather services that I mentioned. But it's still, okay, 60 million sounds like a lot of money, but it's still only in about six countries, and not the entire country in each case. The SDG targets meant to be achieved by 2030. What's that, 8 years from now? So far, we're actually falling back on some of the SDGs. We're nowhere near achieving those promises. It's very likely that we're going to see an increase in food and water shortages and hunger and droughts. And aside from the humanitarian aspects of that, there's very strong evidence that climate change impacts of that kind actually lead to destabilizing societies. And I assisted with developing a paper from the Central American Dry Corridor, the sort of Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras area, where it's clear that drought caused by climate change is a major cause for people leaving farming and trying to come to the US. So we're here directly affected and a major political issue for the country that we haven't resolved yet, let alone humanitarian issue for those people. We're nowhere near solving it. So coming to my conclusions. First of all, climate change is making agricultural production more challenging everywhere, including our own farmers. And it's especially challenging for people with very few resources and capital or cushions to fall back on. The second point is that international research is a major success story. They've achieved huge breakthroughs. They have made differences at scale in many ways on crop varieties and so on. The fact that, you remember, in the 1960s, there was the predictions of mass starvation and so on. It was the CG and other researchers working together that managed to come up with more productive crops and cultivation methods and so on. So it's a major success story. It's a good investment, big returns, but hardly anyone knows about it. And it's not getting enough resources stably, year after year, guaranteed to meet its real potential. The third point is, as I think I've just illustrated in this talk, solutions exist to reverse the decline in food and water security globally. We know a lot of things that we can already do. But in order to do them, we need a lot more financial and human resources. If we're not willing to spend the money, train the people, and get them going, then we're not going to do it. In the long run, I think most of us understand the whole food system needs to be transformed from field to fork, as they say. We need to reduce food waste. I mean, that's as big a problem, maybe a bigger problem in many developing countries because they have poor methods for storage and transport of food, for example. Changing our diets to reduce the amount of red meat and increasing plant-based nutritious food. And finally, I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about charity. I don't think development funding is charity at all. It's in our own political and economic interest to invest in helping poor countries adapt and become resilient and prosperous. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Merrey. That was very interesting, very informative. Let me just preempt anybody else asking questions here. You mentioned in some cases trying to change cultures from their traditional crops to more perhaps water efficient crops. And but at the same time, you also mentioned, you showed a slide of two women in Sri Lanka who were beaming over getting insurance for their rice crop. Well, rice, of course, is very water intensive. It also produces methane, like wetlands do. Is there an effort to pull farmers and the food market generally in South Asia away from rice?
That's a very interesting question, and there's no simple answer. First of all, leaving rice aside, well, no, it includes rice to some extent. There are efforts to revive the demand and therefore production of things like millets and sorghum. Before the Europeans brought maize from the New World to Africa and Asia, they didn't grow maize or corn at all. Their diets were based on sorghum and millet and rice, but I'll come back to rice. And millets are much more drought resistant. There are now very productive varieties of it, but it's very hard to change people. I was very well aware in South Africa that whereas our housekeeper, who was a senior citizen, had her food was based on the millets, her children ate corn, not millet, as their main staple. So that culture change is not easy to do, but it'll probably happen over the next 15 to 20 years. Turning to rice, obviously those foods are potential substitutes for rice, but a lot of where rice is grown, particularly in Asia, you can't grow anything else in those soils. And efforts to shift them from rice to, say, vegetable crops and so on have had very little success. So what you do see is more and more research trying to figure out how to grow the rice using less water and producing less methane. The methane comes, as I understand it, from the rotting of the weeds and so on, and of other vegetation from maintaining the water levels in the rice paddies. But if you periodically irrigate the rice, then drain the rice and wait a week or so and then irrigate again, you can actually reduce the water usage by a reasonable amount, 20-25%. You can decrease the methane by some amount, but I don't know what it is. It's supposed to be, I've heard that it's quite significant, but I haven't read I don't have the data. So that kind of thing is happening, but there's no way those Sri Lankan women on their rice paddies can grow something else. Leaving aside the difficulty of getting Sri Lankans to eat anything except rice.
Right, years ago, I read about an effort to pelletize wheat, which of course uses much less water. Pelletize wheat as a substitute for rice, and just wasn't accepted. No. So Ellen Siegel indicated first a couple of questions. One is, how can these smallholder farmers have cell phones?
Ah, that's a very good question. If you go to the most distant parts of sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent, you will find that nearly everybody has a cell phone. And nowadays, most of them they're cheap versions of an iPhone. They may not be an iPhone, but they are able to get onto the web so that people can go online and they can check, what's the market price for my crop in a town 30 miles away or whatever. And the cell phone companies have figured out how to provide this service at an extremely low cost. I mean, to me, it's criminal what we pay for cell phone services here. Because I've had cell phones in South Africa, and I got one in Kenya when I was running a project there for 4 months. The Kenyan one, I bought the phone for about $25. That was a higher level phone. There were cheaper ones. And then I would buy a little card and scratch the number and enter it every time I needed more power in it. Those cost me about $1 for, maybe 30 hours. And the companies have set up systems. So you'd find this in many countries now in Africa, and it's coming now in Asia, where you pay your taxi driver with your cell phone. You pay for your meal at a restaurant with your cell phone. You pay your electricity bill with your cell phone. You get your salary put into the account in your cell phone. And the fees that charged are minimal. They're like, a small percentage of a percent. So that's why it's so common. It's absolutely incredible how fast these have rolled out and how important they've become for people.
Thank you. Let's see. People are sending in questions on chat, but at the same time, somebody sent a question early on to Julianne. Was the plunge in the cost of solar energy due to the mass production of solar panels in China?
I'm sure that's a major contributor.
Yeah.
Yes, when you go to scale that kind of thing, you can build 1 million cars a lot cheaper per car than you can if you're building 25 cars.
Right.
It's not only that though, it's probably the technology is also getting better. The panels are getting more efficient. I'm sure that the panels that are on our roof will be out of date in another 4 or 5 years, for example.
And as a matter of fact, there's a bill in the Florida legislature that would really make residential and business solar rooftop solar panels economically would discourage them financially. Yeah, that's thanks to Florida Power and Light. So another person says, great talk. How does one assess the conditions that make it difficult to raise the cattle? And then how does the index insurance work for cattle raisers?
Okay, so I'm not an expert in the technology per se, but now there are freely available satellite-based data that measure the vegetation, the quality of the vegetation, whether it's under stress or is highly productive or whatever, soil moisture and temperature. And then there are mathematical algorithms that can combine all of that and come up with an index that tells you how likely it is that the pasture that people are using has enough food for the cattle. So that's basically what it is.
Yeah.
And the algorithms are all done through computers. So once you get it programmed, it just happens. It just goes on automatically. There's very little running cost involved, except for tweaking and updating.
Bob Bernstein has his hand up. He'd like to ask a question. Bob Bernstein?
Yes, Doug, I know you were working in smaller poor countries. The U.S. is neither, but do we have any good or bad examples for other countries? I remember driving Southern California near the Salton Sea and the Mexican border, and it's desert and it's 100 degrees out, and there's square miles of a sprinkler just spraying water into the air from the Colorado River. And I think that's not sustainable. Do we have things to teach, or from bad examples, do we have things to learn from what the US does?
I think we have maybe two things. First of all, there's a lot of technology that our farmers have access to, produced from our universities and so on, that can be downscaled and applied in developing countries. And a lot of this satellite data business, a lot of that was originally from American research and European research. The other thing is, interestingly enough, since I'm sort of stuck on groundwater aquifers, we do have a few positive cases of managing aquifers and restoring them from being overpumped. And one is Nebraska, where they've put together policies that encourage farmers to collaborate and manage, limit how much they pump water. So we have some institutional innovations, but mostly it's really the technologies that we've produced, in my opinion. And you're right, we're also examples of things that are simply not sustainable, and you gave an excellent example.
Yeah, if I may say, you mentioned groundwater issues, over pumping. That's going on in Florida too. And in some areas, it's been going on for many, many decades, really since the 1950s. And the Florida Water Resources Act, passed in 1972, intended to address those issues. But politics being what it is, it has not worked out the way that the authors intended. So we continue to overpump our
that applies
aquifer.
to legislation around the world. Governments have failed to regulate successfully groundwater quality and quantity.
Yeah. John Axe has a question. John?
Yes, so that was a nice talk, Doug. You mentioned mostly Africa and India, but we hear a lot about cutting the rainforest in the Amazon, planting, destroying a lot of the native plants, and you get maybe a couple of crops, but because the soil is not rich enough to sustain those crops, you move on, cut off the next swath, and so on. What is the situation there? And is there enough attention given to South America with respect to these other places that you're talking about?
Okay, good question. My understanding is, under the previous government in Brazil, they were beginning to get a handle on reducing the rate of deforestation and eventually moving perhaps to even reforestation. But the current government has reversed all of that and has made things even worse. And there's not a great deal we can do about it, unfortunately. It's too bad, because a place like the Amazon rainforest is really a global good. It's not just a national good. So it's a flaw in our whole international structure. Similarly, in Africa, most of the increase in food production over the last 30 years has not been from increasing yields, although yields have increased some, and lately in some places more rapidly. Most of it is through expansion into areas that were previously forest or rangeland or whatever. So it is a big issue. The solution is thought to be what's called sustainable intensification, and using more manure, rotating crops, intercropping with nitrogen fixing crops, no plowing, just, conservation, agriculture kinds of things. But the research is really mixed even on a lot of that. I mean, it works sometimes in some places, but it doesn't seem to be a universal panacea.
Ellen Siegel, you had some unanswered questions you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I've heard some resistance about companies like Monsanto, which is the only one I can think of, controlling the seeds that are distributed in Africa and Asia. And any attempt to move away from that is met with a lot of resistance. And I understand the issue of biodiversity, and if everybody's planting the same kind of seed, there's no chance for any biodiversity to work against a drought or a pest or a fungus or anything like that. Is there any research on controlling the seed supply that's being sold to the farmers?
That's an extremely important area, and not one that I'm a real expert on, but I'm aware of some things going on.
Yeah.
As you said, Monsanto may have some really great crops that in the short run are really quite profitable for farmers and for Monsanto and so on, but it gets risky over the longer term. What some of my colleagues in the CG research centers have been doing is developing community organizations that produce certified seeds. And a lot of governments, for example, Ethiopia, they don't want Monsanto selling their farmers the seeds. They don't want to depend on Western companies, whatever the potential benefits may be in the short run. So governments there have supported farmers to learn how to grow seed that, is good quality seed. It's based on local research or maybe even some international research, but it's not licensed by Monsanto. So it's a public good. These seed companies, farmer companies, if you will, grow the seed, make it available to their neighbors and beyond. And that's slowly scaling up. And to me, that's probably the best solution.
That's exciting. Thank you.
Any more questions?
You know,
Okay.
one of Ellen's questions was, where do they get the power source for the cell phones? I was curious about that too.
Well, if you have a solar panel, you can charge it.
Is that what they're doing? Okay.
Well, I mean, some people they have access to electricity, or they get a battery, and they use a battery to charge it, and then take the battery to town and have it recharged and bring it back again. There are big efforts going on, particularly in Africa, where there's no chance of putting out, wires all over the continent in the next 20 years. So they're providing home level or community level solar electricity installations. So a small community or neighborhood, for example, would purchase or even rent the panels, the solar panels and the wires and switches and so on that you need to go with it. And then they pay a monthly fee, but it's a low fee because the running costs are not high. Okay, the initial cost was high, but those costs are getting lower. You can subsidize communities so that they can purchase the panels and manage them and electrify, or even at home level. So that's becoming a lot more common.
Any further questions from anybody? Well, thank you very much, Dr. Merrey. It's been obviously a lot of interested. Oh, okay, here's the spoiler. Oh, spoiler alert, last class, I'll ask for input from this group on what has struck you from each of the classes you attended, 1 or 2 items only. So Ellen is our final speaker, our wind-up speaker. And the next speaker is Dr. and Professor Andrew Rosenberg, who will talk about the societal and political consequences of potential climate change impacts. So I hope to see everybody there. And thank you again, Dr. Merrey. This was fantastic.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and being such a good audience.